In this video, we're going to do learning objectives A and B. We're going to simplify negative square roots, and then we will simplify imaginary numbers. This first one is talking about how do we deal with negative square roots. So what you want to come away with here is this first property. It's that the square root of a negative 1, whenever you see that, you're going to replace it with the letter I. And let's just focus on that component. So when I look at this radical, which is the square root of negative 2, I can rewrite negative 2 as negative 1 times 2. I can split that up to be the negative square root of a negative 1 times the square root of 2. Now remember, whenever I see a square root of a negative 1, I'm going to replace it with the letter I. So I'm going to put an I in its place and then do the square root of 2. And that's my answer. Number 2 is similar. I'm going to break this up into the square root of negative 1 times 16, because that gives me negative 16, which is the square root of negative 1 and the square root of 16. Square root of negative 1 is the letter I. Now be careful, the square root of 16, what number 2 times a 16 is 4. Now typically we don't put the I first unless it has a radical behind it. So if it's I and then the radical symbol, that's what we do. We would normally do 4i is how we would type this. Similar to how you would write 4x if it was a particular variable. Number 3, this negative sign, let's just leave it floating out there because it's sitting there, and deal with the square root of negative 7, which is negative 1 times 7. Again, I'm going to keep that negative there. I'm going to separate these two. Remember the square root of negative 1, this becomes the letter I. This negative is still just sitting out there, and the square root of 7 is there. In this case, I put the I in front of it because this is a square root, or we call a radical symbol, and that is what I would type into my Schoology answer. Now as we move on to the second learning objective, I do want to go back up here, and let's take a look at the square root of negative 1 equals I. If I take this and I square both sides, when you square a square root, they actually go away, so the square root of negative 1 squared becomes negative 1. And the right-hand side here is I squared. So we just created a second rule, and that is I squared equals negative 1. So when we go and look at imaginary numbers on the next page, we're going to use this rule. So I'm going to jot that down. I squared equals negative 1. I'm also going to recall the square root of negative 1 is the number or letter I. If we look at number 4, you're going to have to simplify this imaginary number. 6 times I squared. Well, whenever you see an I squared, you now need to replace it with the number negative 1. So this is 6 times negative 1, which simplifies to negative 6. Number 5 has a little twist to it. Be careful. 4i is being squared, which means you have to do 4i twice. So it means 4i times 4i. Well, that becomes 4 times 4 or 16. I times I is I squared. Don't stop here. Remember, I squared is negative 1. So I'm going to replace I squared with a negative 1 and get a negative 16. Now, number 6 is a little more involved too. You're going to be tempted to write 2i twice because it says negative 2i squared. But you're going to want to notice that this little 2 is only touching this I. It has nothing to do with this negative 2. That negative 2 is just floating out in front of the I squared. So I'm going to write the negative 2 and just keep it there. And I'm almost going to separate it out like this and write it I squared. Now this problem would have been like number 5 if it looked like this. If I had written this squared with parentheses, then I would have to do negative 2i times negative 2i. It is not that. Notice the difference. So this is not the case. So let's go back up here. We have negative 2i, or negative 2 times I squared. Remember, I squared is negative 1. So negative 2 times negative 1 would simplify to the number 2. You really want to be careful between 4, 5, and 6 and how they're different, and just be cautious in those types of problems.